We're excited to have you join us for the Come Follow Me 2021 podcast and study of the Doctrine and Covenants, hosted by Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville, and presented by Gospel Doctrine Answers. In today's podcast, we will study Doctrine and Covenants 30 through 36. You are called to preach my gospel. Don't miss the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Virtual tickets on sale at bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com. Viewing begins April 9th.
Hi, I'm Rod Meldrum, and I want to welcome you to the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference, and it's also part of the Firm Foundation Expo. Folks, if you have been watching this research and seen this unfold over the last number of years, last year, as you know, in April, we had to go virtual. Virtual actually has turned out to be a pretty good way to do a conference because it allows you to have full access to everything. In the previous conferences, we've had 5 or 6 speakers at the same time, and if you didn't go to the one that you wanted, or if you couldn't get into the one that you wanted, then you weren't able to see that. We've eliminated that. We can see every single speaker, stop and take care of other things if you want to, and resume again when you want to, all in the streaming video site. So I want to encourage you to come and join us for our 3rd virtual expo. This is going to be in the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. We have some amazing speakers coming up for you, incredible new research. I know Wayne May and many others have gotten a lot of new things that they're going to be sharing with you. So if you'd like to join us, and also you'll have access to most of all our previous conferences and all the talks and the presentations that have been done there. It is the largest repository of information and research on the Book of Mormon that's ever been assembled. So please join us, come and check out the expo, and I think you're going to really enjoy it.
Don't miss the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Viewing begins April 9th. Yearly subscribers get a $15 discount at bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.
David, you've been very patient here as I've kind of gone through my little rendition here. So what I'd like to do is have you tell me a little bit more about how you began your research and what was happening with that.
Yeah, so well, first of all, just so everyone knows, Rod and I are completely independent in terms of independent of each other in terms of research that we've done. But it was actually through Rod that I started to research the DNA. My mother had come across his materials and the DVDs in particular related to the DNA evidence and had become interested in that. And she shared them with me. And I reviewed those and started looking more into the information. I read Rod's material. I watched his material. I also read the materials written by critics, both in the church and out of the church, related to Rod's material. And just an aside, there were some criticisms that were pretty unfair. They were pretty unfair and unjust to Rod in, personal attacks and things. But nevertheless, I became interested in the subject, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out for myself what the science really said. So I embarked on my own journey to look at the primary sources, to look at the scientific research it for myself, and find out what the science really said. And I was prepared for an answer that there was no evidence. I mean, that was actually one of the arguments that, some of the ones from BYU and the church were saying, for example, is that we can't expect to find the DNA. So I was prepared for that answer, that there was no evidence of DNA evidence for the Book of Mormon. But that's not what I found. And what I found as I went to the scientific journals and I read the articles and, hundreds of hours, thousands of pages of that kind of stuff. And what I found is that Rod was right in terms of the haplogroup X, that there are these lines for the haplogroup X, it's the matrilineal line. So it's the mother's mother, mother, mother. And it's on that line, as Rod indicated, there are 5 lines, and 4 of them appear Asian in origin, but one of them doesn't. And when you look at where it occurs in the old world, the best fit like Rod said, is the Middle East. It's the place that has the greatest variety of it, the greatest concentration of it. And the science is actually pretty clear that it comes from the Middle East. And now the critics say, well, it must have come from the Middle East through Asia then, because they don't want to let go of the Bering Strait migration theory for those people. But the fact is that there's no trail of evidence across Siberia. And so there's no evidence supporting that. And it's really kind of unrealistic to think that they, went across Asia and left no DNA evidence behind as they migrated. So yeah, the closest location, the closest relatives to the haplogroup X that you find in Native Americans in the Northeast North America, the closest relative is in the Middle East. And, actually, surprisingly, another thing I found was that, among the Native Americans who have haplogroup X, there's actually two subtypes of that. There's a haplogroup X2A, and that's the main type. Mm-hmm. And then there's a small group, X2G. And the X2G is right there in some of the same tribes in the Ojibwa, in particular with X2A. And so it's clear they're, common ancestry for those two types. But it turns out that X2A, the dominant type, is actually closer related genetically to the Middle Eastern type, so type X2J in the Middle East, than it is to the other Native American X2G type. So it's actually pretty strong connection to the Middle East. The other thing I found as I went through the evidence was that there are other DNA, there's other DNA evidence and also blood type evidence that corroborates and fits with the haplogroup X evidence. In particular,
before you go, let me just jump in for just a second, though. The research that I was doing was primarily back in 2008, and from 2002 or 3 up to about 2008 or 9, and that's when I basically came up with my first DVD and started to share this information with other people. Most of what you were just talking about has happened in what kind of time frame?
Well, there's some that does go back prior to that, but a lot of it has come out since then. Yeah. And one of the interesting things that came out too is that Kennewick man testing his haplogroup X, and I'll talk about him a little bit too.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah. So, sorry we're doing this by Zoom, so it's possible I'll have some noise that happens in the background as family comes and goes, but hopefully not. We'll see. So with the DNA testing, there's the matrilineal line. There's also a patrilineal line that can be tested. It's on the Y chromosome. So it's only through the males. It's a father, father, father. It's a Y DNA since it's tested. It's DNA that's on the Y chromosome. And when they tested the DNA on the Y chromosome, that Y DNA for Native Americans, what they found was that there are 3 main lines, and 2 of them kind of fit with Asia again. A third line is non-Asian in origin, and so they started to write it off saying, well, this must be European intermixture after Columbus. But what they found in particular in Northeast North America with the Ojibwa and some of those tribes, the Algonquin tribes, is that they were finding so much of it. In some tribes, as much as 60% of the men had this DNA type. They're finding so much of it. And they're also finding out that the DNA was diversely mutated. So it mutated a lot from anything they were finding in Europe. So they were saying, well, okay, this is not an Asian type. We can find it over in Europe and the Middle East and other places like that. But they found that the Native Americans had mutations of it that no longer existed over in the old world, or they couldn't find it over there. Which as many as 8 mutation, and they're saying, well, so they're starting to think maybe it is ancient because it's a lot of mutations to happen just since Columbus.
Yeah, so it means that basically it's something that's happened a long time ago.
Right.
So that's why they're thinking, well, gosh, it wasn't something that happened just recently.
Right. And so I'm going to share my screen and share a couple of slides with you, and I'm going to show you a little bit where haplogroup X occurs, and then this Y DNA is called Y DNA haplogroup R, where that occurs, and I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So give me just a second here. Okay, hopefully you see that. Do you see that, Ron?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this first one is haplogroup X globally, and just like Rod said, when you look at, these are of native populations, so When you look at the native populations and where haplogroup X occurs, it's in the among Native Americans in North America, highest concentration in Northeast North America. And then in the Old World, the highest concentrations sort of in that Mediterranean area.
Now, one thing before you go, these maps that you're using here, these illustrations, those are not ones that you or I made.
That's correct. Yeah, this was put together by a researcher, and you can just find it right through Wikipedia or other places. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, and then here is a similar one. This is for the Y DNA haplogroup R that I was just talking about, where it's found globally. And as you'll see there, it occurs among Native Americans in Northeast North America primarily. And then it's not, so white means essentially that there is none. So you see through the major East Asian populations, those types of populations that the scientists traditionally think, populated the Americas. It's not found there. Instead, it's found in Caucasian, essentially populations. And Caucasian populations include Europe, Middle East, and some of that Central South Asia area. And so it's definitely a non-Asian type. It's a relatively Caucasian type DNA. It ends up, and I'm going to put in this next slide, the haplogroup X and the Y DNA haplogroup R together. When you put them side by side, it's really clear that it's two separate lines of DNA now, the matrilineal line, the patrilineal line. They both point to the same populations, the same groups that have that non-Asian DNA type. And now the consensus in the science, unfortunately, generally says for the matrilineal line, the haplogroup X on the left, they say, well, we think that came before the Book of Mormon. We think that was, 15, 16,000 years ago, and it's kind of based off of some evolutionary theories and assumptions that they have there. And then on the one on the right, they say, well, we think that came after Columbus. And but actually the evidence is pushing them together. The Y DNA is clearly ancient when you look again at how many have it and how diversely mutated it is. It's not reasonable to think that came from Columbus. And when you look at the two lines together, they clearly point to a common population. And that sort of fits the heartland area, as you've said. Now, there's other, you talked a little bit about DNA in other areas. I would say that there is diffuse small levels of a Mediterranean, potentially could be Jewish DNA that's found throughout Americas, but it's a small level, and it's generally written off as having come over post-Columbus. But there was a recent study in 2018 that conceded that the amount that they were seeing was more than what you would expect from just the historical records of what came over since Columbus. So I would say that there is a little bit of DNA evidence showing a signal, diffuse, smaller throughout the Americas, but clearly the highest concentration of DNA is right where the heartland area is, like Rod had discussed. I'm going to show that in actually just a second here. Okay, so this is a third type of DNA testing. This is called autosomal DNA testing. And in this type of testing, it's not, the straight matrilineal line or patrilineal line. Instead of it's sort of a panorama of the ancestry, and they sample different parts. And there are types, DNA types that signal from this. And in this slide, African type DNA types, they color with an orange, and that's the bottom left of the slide here. So if they see an African type of DNA, they put an orange there. If it's an East Asian type of DNA, it's this pink. And if it's unique Native American type, which is generally Asian based, it's this purple color. And then there's this Caucasian type DNA, and they color it this bluish type. And it, as I said, it actually covers for Europe, the Middle East, and some Central and South Asia. Not East Asia, not the China and Japan, those top populations, but for some of the Central South Asia, you get these sort of Caucasian DNA types, and they color it blue. And when they've done samples throughout the Americas, what you find is, so here are sample populations throughout the Americas. And what you see is that the Northeast, North America, these Algonquin tribes, a few of the three of these on the far left of the slide, they have much higher levels of this sort of blue non-Asian DNA. Autosomal DNA shows up, which fits with what we saw from the matrilineal DNA and the patrilineal DNA. So that fits. But then what you're seeing with the tribes through the rest of the Americas, it's not very much, but you will see little bits of blue through there, right? This sort of non-Asian DNA that's in most, that shows up, not in everyone, but most of these other tribes. And as I said, in 2018, they did, some scientists, non-members, they conceded that what they're seeing was more than would be expected based off of what they just saw from historical records of the conquistadores and the Spanish interactions and stuff. So there's a little bit of interesting thought there in terms of the blood of Lehi having spread around more diffusely. And we don't know all the stories with that. But anyway, going back a little bit to the haplogroup X, as I said, the closest place that it's found, the closest relative for a haplogroup X2A is the Middle Eastern relative, and that's X2J. And it's very rare. It's only been found twice, once both in the Middle East, once in Egypt. It shows a little spot here shown on the map in Egypt by an oasis there. And up at the top right of that map, you see Jerusalem. And then the other one was found in Iran, were the closest relatives to this haplogroup X 2A type. Then just briefly regarding blood types, I wanted to mention as well, because blood types are also something that show ancestry, and that's also something that's been tested. And what they find is that Native Americans have some unique, their blood type distribution is unique. So Native Americans are essentially virtually all type O. And that's different from Asia. It's different from the Asian populations. And so it's yet another point that corroborates the DNA evidence and shows that it's not just an exclusive Asian ancestry, but it's different for the Americas. And in addition to almost all Native Americans being blood type O, there is a particular variant of blood type O, and it's blood type, it's O1V542A. It's a neutral variant. Technically speaking, so it's blood type O. It's just it's got a unique mutation there that can be tracked for ancestry. It doesn't really affect anything functionally for the blood. But throughout the Americas, these tribes will have this blood type variant show up here and there throughout the tribes throughout the Americas. And so it's clearly old and widely distributed. But when they look at the old world, can they find this blood type variant? They don't see it in the large Asian populations. They don't see it in China, Japan, Korea, all these other large Asian populations. Instead, they haven't really found it except for a few isolated spots, and one of those is in the Middle East. That particular one was in Kuwait. So yet there's yet another little piece too, which is interesting with the blood type. Now, I have put, let me stop the screen sharing there. So as I did the research and I found all this, it's kind of been assembled, and then just within the last few months or so, we published this book, The Face of a Nephite. And right there, and this has the details and the citations through it, and you can get it through Rod's website. He's agreed to sell it, thankfully. But we're excited
about it, actually, David. And in fact, this is brand new, so probably I don't think hardly anybody has it at this point in time, but we have a pretty nice stock of those, so you can go onto the website, bookofmormonevidence.org, at the bookstore. Right. I have found it to be absolutely fascinating, and you also had an audio part that was pretty amazing. That I love that too. Yeah,
and I wrote it, and it's written at two levels at the same time. So it's got long relatively longish footnotes on each page for those that want to dig into the sources. And so there's the page sites that people can look up the quotes, and they can research on their own for those that are detailed. And those that aren't as interested in that, they can read along. So it kind of covers at two different levels the topic. So hopefully it's accessible for as many people as possible. But there was one other part, and that was to bring back Kennewick Man. And so on this book, it's like, who is this guy at the front? And I have to say, one of my relatives said I thought it was just a picture of Jesus. He said, so this is Kennewick Man. This is an artistic recreation of an ancient Native American skeleton called Kennewick Man.
Wow.
Kennewick Man was found in Washington State, and there was actually the reason we have so much information on him was that there was a dispute as to whether he was Native American or not, because they found the bones tested as ancient thousands of years ago, but the appearance didn't look like a typical Native American look.
Now tell us, his name came from where the bones were found.
Yeah, Kennewick, Washington, in Washington State. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I just find that absolutely fascinating that the facial features of this person that's on the front of your book here.
Right. Yeah. So, like I said, that's with the skull. It was the Smithsonian that did it. They did a recreation of it, and he really does. He has very Caucasian features, and which is interesting for us with the Book of Mormon, because Kennewick Man tested his haplogroup X, so he fits this DNA type, which has this connection to the Middle East, and he looks like somebody that could very well have a Middle Eastern ancestry as opposed to an Asian ancestry. Now, the critics for Kennewick Man will point to it's generally said that, okay, well, the carbon date testing says that he's over 8,000 years ago, so that's before Book of Mormon timeframes. But what I go into in the book is that that's not the full story, because he was actually tested many times on the carbon date testing, 20 times. Well, 5 of the 20 as a minority, but 5 of the 20 actually fit Book of Mormon timeframes, sort of that 2,200 to 2,600 years ago time frame. And so then what I do in the book is I go through, sorry about the phone, I go through the burial circumstances and the surrounding evidence. And with carbon date, many won't know this, but with carbon dates, they can be affected by surrounding conditions. And so, for example, the amount of it's based off the amount of carbon that's left in the bones or the specimen, but that can be affected by the surrounding conditions. So, like if it's in an environment where recent roots can interact, they'll end up looking younger or newer. And if it's an environment that has very little carbon, like glacial meltwater, which is the area where Kennewick Man was found, was right by the Columbia River, and there's that glacial meltwater that kind of soaks through and permeates the soil in the area. You know, that even the sediments around him tested impossibly old in some circumstances. So there's a lot of evidence of this sort of artificial aging, of making things look older than they were. And so when you look at while a lot of the carbon date testing showed this 8,000 or more years ago, there was some that didn't. And I think that the best explanation for it is that there was some artificial aging that occurred, and that his real age is probably right around 2,200 years ago, which it fits right around the Book of Mormon times. So it's a pretty exciting thing. It's a theory, but I think people like it, and it definitely supports the work that you did, Rod.
And that's basically bringing in autosomal DNA as well as the father's the Y chromosomal DNA. Part of the reason why I didn't do any of that research before is because it wasn't available back when I was doing the research.
Right, the autosomal DNA is all recent. Yeah, the autosomal DNA is all more recent, and the patrilineal, that Y DNA, also hasn't been done that extensively. So, and it all came a little bit later and ended up corroborating the work that you found.
Well, you know what? I just think so. There's a lot more information that you have been able to share in this book, and we have just a few more minutes left here. David, is there any other particular things? Now, I'll just say this: when it came down to the dating part of the haplogroup X DNA, which is the matrilineal side of things, and that is that they originally thought that the DNA arrived here 46,000 years ago. That's one of the things that I found that I address in a lot of detail in the book, Rediscovering the Book of Mormon Remnant Through DNA, because it's the dating part of it that really became the crux of the argument against the haplogroup X, haplogroup R, being Book of Mormon related, because they said, well, it showed up here in America long before Lehi and his family came around 600 BC. So
it's all about the dating, and the dating's all based on assumptions that actually can't be verified.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just going to share with you in this book. It's Rediscovering the Book of Mormon Remnant Through DNA on page 104. This is actually coming from Science, the journal Science, which is, of course, one of the biggest journals in the world, one of the most prestigious journals in the United States, at least. It says the most widely used mutation rate for non-coding human mitochondrial DNA relies on estimates of the date when humans and chimpanzees shared a common ancestor, taken to be about 5 million years ago. Well, if your underlying assumption, like mine is that we never came from apes, if that's not something that didn't happen, then the rest of this assumption is basically meaningless, right? It says the date is based on counting the mitochondrial DNA and protein differences between all the great apes and timing their divergence using dates from fossils of one great ape's ancestor. In humans, this yields a rate of about one mutation every 300 to 600 generations, or about one in every 6,000 to 12,000 years, assuming the generation is 20 years. Says molecular anthropologist Mark Stoneking of Pennsylvania State University and University Park. It goes on to say, and this is on page 105 in the book here, it says, quote, assuming, now this is actually from Genetics Journal, the journal called Genetics. It says, assuming 6 million years for the human and chimp species split, and a 6.5 million years for the most recent common ancestor of their mitochondrial DNA lineages, we estimated the average transversion rate at synonymous and RNA positions at 2.1 times 10 to the minus 9. Anyway, long story short, using the observed relative rates of different substitution types in humans, the average transition rate at 4,212 synonymous positions and so forth over this position over all genes in mitochondrial DNA thus would be equivalent to the accumulation of one synonymous transition every 6,764 years on average. So basically, they're talking about this. How did they get the mutation rate of the DNA so they can tell how much the DNA has changed from ancient populations to more modern populations? And it's completely pulled out of thin air from assumptions that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor 5 to 6 million years ago. And of course, in the scriptures here we have, it discusses about that. Did we come from apes? Did we come from lower life forms?
And this is something that you had raised several years ago too, Rod, but when they have done long-term pedigree assessments to look at, okay, it's hard to do, but there are some, quite long-term pedigree assessments where they can look at the ancestor, they can look at the descendants, and they say, okay, well, how many mutations occurred? Right. And when they look at that, of course, the mutation rates are random. They're completely random. They can be fast or slow, but consistently what they find nevertheless is that it's always much faster than what they had assumed that it was. So, the really slow mutation rate, which gives these very old dates, are based on assumptions that to the extent that they can be tested in long-term pedigrees, they don't pan out.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the reason why all the confusion, the dating, when I was doing my research on the mitochondrial DNA, they were saying that mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X had showed up here in America 45,000 years, or I think it was 48,000 years ago at first, and then it came down to like 31,000 years, and then it was 22,000 years, and it was 11,000 years to 12,000 years. But if you actually use the observed rate from the actual pedigree studies rather than the theoretical rate that they were using, for this other material, it actually came out to be exactly in the middle of the Book of Mormon time frames. It was amazing how they actually found out that the haplogroup X would actually be around 2,400 years ago, is when the haplogroup X DNA would have arrived here in America if you use the actual observed rate of change. And that's what I found was just fascinating.
And it's just exciting. I mean, I'd love for the members of the church to know this. It's really exciting information that is very, very faith promoting. It's hard to get through the science, but the science actually does work out. It just takes a little bit to work through some of the false presumptions and assumptions and announcements about the science that really don't meet what the data is actually showing. Because like when you go and you read these scientific journals, what you find is you have to sort of separate what's the actual data they saw, and then what are they doing in terms of assumptions and interpreting that data. And what I consistently found was that the actual data was not bad. It was actually fairly supportive, and you find things in the data, but then it's always, messed up with these assumptions and interpretations and twisting of the facts that they would do about it. But the data actually does work out.
It's kind of funny. It's kind of like the old adage that says that figures don't lie, but liars can figure. So a lot of times what we find in science, and unfortunately happens much too often, is that if the data doesn't fit with the current theory, then they try to figure out ways to manipulate and alter the data to fit the theory, rather than change their theory to actually fit with what the data says. And and this is a prime example of that. In fact, in my book, I have there was like an ongoing argument in the genetics journals back and forth from different people who are advocating the two different primary dating methods, and which one do we reconcile? Because they had orders, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude difference between the theoretical dating method and the actual observed dating. And that was, and they were actually arguing back and forth, which one should we use? He says we shouldn't use a sundial for a stopwatch.
Well, and I think everybody, I mean, we're obviously coming out of a pandemic, and I don't want to get off a topic about that, but I think people are starting to understand that the science is often a lot of assumptions and guesswork. And so, I think members have a hard time when you have someone come with an impressive academic degree or something, and they say this is, they say something and it sounds like it's fact, and you feel like I can't fact check that. But then what you find over time is that it's often based on and interpreted through assumptions and filters that ends up twisting and distorting, and you get these opinions that are wrong, and it makes it hard for church members. But I'm hoping that your work and this Face of a Nephite book can help people, make it through those mists of darkness, so to speak, and find their way, because actually the evidence does support the Book of Mormon. I hope people don't lose their faith like that.
That's well said, David. That's well said. I find it fascinating that if you look at the political realm a little bit, you have both sides basically saying, well, we follow the science. Well, the top scientists started off saying that masks were of no efficacy. There was no use for masks, that wouldn't change anything or do anything, and yet that changed. I mean, science changes very often. To a large extent, what is accepted as science has a lot more to do with politics and a lot more to do with personal interpretations and personal agendas and agendas of the scientific community than it does with actual truth and facts. And so I just want to warn people that like I said, the data doesn't lie. The data is the data. But there are people who try to manipulate the data for their particular purposes, and we see that so often. So you can't just assume that just because they say it's scientific that means it's the truth.
Yeah.
that makes sense. All right, so there's a couple of things in verses 31 to 43 of section 29. Now, we've already covered section 30 and 32 portions that I wanted to cover about the other missionaries, basically going out and those kind of things. One thing I find that I'm not sure if I was going to bring this up or not, but I wanted to point out here. Let me see if I can get to this in the book Saints here, the newest church history book, Standard of Truth. It's interesting to note that in every one of these revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants in sections 28 and 30 and 32, the Lord talks about these people as being the Lamanites. For whatever reason, the church historians who did Saints decided to change the Lord's words. They actually altered the Lord's words in here, and instead they used the terms like American Indians or Native Americans and so forth. And the reason why is because there are some who are in the church history department who want to continue to promote this idea of Central America, even though there's no DNA evidence in any kind of support of the Book of Mormon claims. But they still want to be able to promote that. And if the Lord is correct in these sections in the Doctrine and Covenants, and he said that they were going to be sent to the Lamanites, and that he was going to go with them and go before them and be their advocate, then it doesn't bode well for those who want to continue to promote this idea of Central America being the location of the Book of Mormon, and the Mayans basically being the ancient Nephite people. And so they literally changed the history, and they literally changed the Lord's words themselves in this particular case. And the word Lamanite doesn't show up in Saints, and neither does the word Cumorah. The hill Cumorah is never mentioned in this new history, this new revisionist history in Saints. So my thing is I like to go back to the original histories written by the original people who were originally there. And some of this other history, the Stoddards and others have been exposing some of the rewriting or revisionist history that we're being looked at, that we're having to deal with right now in the church. And the problem is that it makes people feel like that sometimes the church hasn't been forthright or truthful, especially the early brethren, that they kind of whitewashed the history and made it to seem a little more grandiose than it really was, and so forth. And those kind of things are very problematic when you start to claim that the early brethren were lying about the history or weren't telling the truth, and that we now have a better truth, which is intermingled with anti-Mormon, sentiments and so forth, which we don't have time to get into the details on that. So. Listen, David, I want to thank you so much for taking your time out, and also for your years of research, and thank you for following up and not just accepting the research that I had done, but you went and basically did your own research and came to your own conclusions. And I'm just so grateful that God has allowed this to come forth as a second witness, really, if you will, of the truthfulness and the literal historicity of the Book of Mormon. It was a real history of real people and real places and real events, and we know who those ancestral people are today because of Joseph Smith and these sections in the Doctrine and Covenants where the Lord revealed to Joseph Smith who these Lamanites are. And I just feel so grateful and blessed.
And its historicity, the truthfulness of it, the authenticity of it, is part of the power of it. That these are real people. Experiences of real people, real events are a lot more powerful, obviously, than fiction, right? And I know that the Book of Mormon is a true book. It's an historical, literal, authentic account, and that's part of my testimony. And I hope that people feel that and know that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. I really hope everybody that as you have an opportunity to listen to this podcast, I hope that you'll feel that desire to go out and actually to explore more deeply some of this information. Get a hold of David's book here, Face of a Nephite. DNA studies in the Book of Mormon. It's the kind of the newest update on the DNA area of research. If you get a chance to go and actually go, if you're a member of the streaming website, then you'll be able to go and actually watch. I think you have 3 or 4 or 5 presentations that you have done. These are hour-long presentations, and you probably only got about 45 minutes or so in here. So
there's a lot that
a lot more information.
Yes. Yeah.
And then also, just again to remind you, have this book you can download for free off of the website, or you can get a hard copy, if you want to pick it up for about $20 or whatever. Rediscovering the Book of Mormon Remnant Through DNA. If you have the DVD set, it's called Book of Mormon Evidence #1. It has the number 3 DVD is on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And if you have the annotated Book of Mormon in the back of that, it has another whole area about this, and actually talks a little bit, just briefly, about haplogroup R. But you're going to want to pick up David's book for additional information. And then, of course, this the Exploring the Book of Mormon America's Heartland book has information about this, kind of as an overview, and also does talk about these. I wish I had time to read you the response that was had from the Native Americans that these first 4 missionaries went to. The chief had an amazing response, and it's in this book, but we don't have time to go into the details on that. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to share these podcasts with you. It's been a real blessing. I want to thank Mike and Nancy for their efforts in putting these things together. And so just to reiterate, so this week, if you're watching this now, you're actually just finishing up part 2. So we hope that you're enjoying these podcasts. If you are enjoying these podcasts, would you please do us a favor and give us a thumbs up, or an endorsement, basically, on the on YouTube or whichever podcasting site you do, and then also, if you wouldn't mind, send out an email or send out a text or 2 or whatever, and let people know about these things. We're doing these for free so that you can just share them for free with other people. It doesn't make any sense to do these things for free if people aren't seeing them. We'd like to see 250,000 people being able to see these things. Right now, I think we're averaging about 15 or 20,000 to 30,000 people, sometimes up to 50 or 60,000 occasionally. We'll see these podcasts. But we need to let the world know that there is beautiful, amazing physical evidence, even though our testimonies aren't based on that evidence. That evidence can and will uphold and bolster and strengthen our testimonies when we understand that there's a physical part and then there's the spiritual part, and the two of them testify of each other in the pages of this incredible book. So there you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
The gathering of Israel is a miracle. It is like an enormous puzzle whose pieces will be set in place prior to the glorious events of the second coming. Just as we might be perplexed with a mountain of puzzle pieces, the early saints must have seen the commission to take the restored gospel to all the world as a nearly impossible task. But they began, one person, one puzzle piece at a time, finding the straight edges, working to rightly frame this divine work. Little by little, the stone cut without hands began to roll forth, from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, and now millions of covenant Latter-day Saints across every nation are connecting the puzzle pieces of this marvelous work and a wonder. Each of us is a piece of the puzzle, and each of us helps to set in place other essential pieces. To our amazing youth and young adults across the world, I give a special invitation and challenge to be witnesses of God. Those who surround you are open to spiritual inquiry. You do not come to the table with empty hands, but with technology and social media at your command. We need you. The Lord needs you to be even more engaged in this great cause. Be open about your faith in Christ. When the occasion presents itself, speak of his life, his teachings, and his incomparable gift to all mankind. Our view ahead is now clear. We can see the miracle continuing and the Lord's hand guiding us as we complete the gaps that remain. Then the great Jehovah shall say, "The work is done," and he will return in majesty and glory.
There's great news for all of you annual subscribers to the Book of Mormon Evidence streaming site. You receive $15 discount on our upcoming virtual conference starting April 9th. And everyone that registers gets a free Hebrew in the Heartland 2-hour bonus presentation by Rod Meldrum. Watch online anytime, anywhere, on any electronic device. And thank you to all of you for listening and watching so we can keep creating new exciting content that uplifts, educates, and inspires.